Somewhere on the edge of the frontier, a lonely barn stands where no man dares to sleep. A mysterious widow offers shelter to cowboys, but only if they survive one haunted night. 25 men failed. This story is about the only one who didn't, and what he saw. The road that led into Stillwater had long since surrendered to the elements. What once was a wagon trail was now a path of dust and bone-dry ruts, carved by the weight of those who came looking for something and left with less. On the outskirts of this half-forgotten town, where the prairie stretched into a horizon that felt like forever, stood a crooked fence enclosing a lonely patch of land. The house, 2 stories of weather-beaten timber and sagging porch beams, watched the world like an old sentry too tired to speak. Behind it sat the barn, bigger than it should have been, taller than any local dared to measure. It was blackened by time, its doors warped like they'd been pushed from the inside, more times than they should have. Nobody in Stillwater wanted that land, not anymore. Not since the night sounds began. Wood groaning when there was no wind, lanterns flickering when they hadn't been lit, the uneasy silence just before sunrise, like the breath held by something ancient. Ranchers who'd once tried to buy the property had backed out without explanation. Surveyors refused to go past the gate. Even horses balked when their riders tried to lead them down that trail. Folks said the earth was cursed. Others whispered the barn was alive, or at least aware. The widow who owned it didn't speak much. She was a tall woman with silver-streaked hair braided low and tight, eyes like storm glass, and a face that had long forgotten how to laugh. Her name was Mrs. Calderon, though nobody called her that. To most, she was just the widow. Her late husband, a man with a temper and a powerful aim, had died under vague circumstances nearly a decade ago. Since then, she lived alone with 2 black horses and a reputation that outlived most campfire stories. No one knew what she did for money. No one saw her in town except for rare visits to the general store, and even then, folks lowered their gaze when she passed. But men came. Drifters, cowboys, outlaws hoping to turn honest. They came in 2s and 3s, some with charm, others with grit. All of them chasing the same idea: to tame the widow's land. The house, the barn, the horses. It was rumored she offered it to any man who could spend a full night inside that barn. Just one night. No tricks, no harm, just sleep until morning. But no one ever lasted. One man ran screaming into the night before midnight, speaking in tongues and clutching at his own ears. Another, a hardened bounty hunter, tied his horse to the fence and walked into the barn with a cigar in his teeth. By morning, he was found curled in the hayloft, shivering like a boy lost in the snow, eyes staring up at the rafters where nothing hung. There was a young preacher once who claimed the place needed holy cleansing. He left with his Bible torn to ribbons and refused to ever talk about what he'd seen. The widow never asked them to stay. She never begged, never explained. She simply stood on her porch, arms folded, as each man approached. "Sleep in the barn," she would say, her voice like gravel soaked in dusk. "If you last, you may stay." That was all. No reward promised, no land deed offered. But they all knew what it meant. The barn was a test, and those who passed would earn more than shelter. They'd earn her trust, maybe even her heart. But no one did. The stories spread beyond Stillwater, carried by saloon whispers and over poker games in distant towns. A haunted barn, they'd say, guarded by a woman who's made of smoke and sorrow. Some dismissed it as a frontier nonsense, the kind of myth desperate men spun when they failed to make a name for themselves. Others weren't so sure. The barn didn't just scare people, it changed them. Even those who watched from the fence line. It spoke of chills that crept up their spines and voices that murmured under the floorboards, voices that didn't speak any language born in this world. Children dared each other to go near the gate and touch the fence. None of them ever crossed it. The widow watched from her porch like a crow perched over a battlefield. She didn't warn, didn't threaten. She didn't need to. The land did that for her. As the years passed, the legend grew teeth. Some said the barn moved at night, not by wind or storm, but by choice, as if it had roots that dug into the earth and a mind that shifted its bones. They said the moon never shone directly on its roof, and that even shadows curved away from it. Others claimed to hear music, an old fiddle tune, slow and sorrowful. Whenever the doors creaked open, even when no one was inside. The widow kept living like the world hadn't forgotten her. She fed her horses, repaired her fence, and watched the land with eyes that seemed to see through time. Her barn remained, silent and patient. It waited, like it knew someone would come who could outlast the voices, the memories, the ghosts. Someone strong enough not just to survive, but to understand. And then, one summer evening, a new rider came. Not loud, not proud, just a cowboy with dust on his boots and shadows in his eyes. He didn't ask for directions. He didn't blink when folks warned him. He tied his horse to the same old post and walked up the steps of the widow's porch like he belonged there. She didn't smile. She didn't flinch. She just looked him over, then nodded toward the barn. "If you ain't scared of the ghosts," she said, "sleep in my barn." And he did. Before the cowboy who came quiet, there were 25 others, some bold, some broken, all sure they'd be the one to last. The first was a loudmouth named Hank Mercer, all swagger and silver spurs. He'd swaggered through Stillwater with a bottle in one hand and a revolver in the other, bragging in the saloon that he'd make the widow his by dawn. The townsfolk didn't try to stop him. They just watched as he strutted up to her porch, tipped his hat, and disappeared into the barn before sundown. By morning, they found him kneeling in the horse trough, muttering to himself in a language no one recognized, eyes wide, mouth bleeding like he'd bitten down on every word he couldn't scream. Then came Jonah Pikes, a preacher's son who'd run from his faith and was looking to prove something. He claimed the devil lived in that barn, and he was going to smoke him out. He carried a Bible in one hand and a lantern in the other. The lantern shattered before midnight. The next day, he was found curled beneath the hay, whispering prayers to something that wasn't in Scripture. His hands were raw, scratched to the bone, as if he'd tried to dig his way out through the walls. There were others, so many others. A bounty hunter with a bullet in his leg who wanted a quiet life. A gambler who lost everything but still smiled. A boy too young to shave but old enough to carry the weight of a war. One by one, they entered the barn with different reasons and the same fate. Some ran before morning, some screamed, some vanished entirely. There was one man, a Civil War veteran with eyes like ash, who left the barn just before dawn and shot himself on the widow's porch. No note, no explanation. Just a single bullet and the look of someone who had seen something that broke the world in two. They came drunk, came desperate, came in love with the idea of a woman whose silence promised mystery. They came thinking the ghost stories were just that, stories. Until the barn closed behind them and the night stretched longer than it should have. Until the wind inside whispered in voices that knew their secrets, their regrets, their sins. Until the lantern flickered and the shadows moved wrong. Until they realized the test wasn't strength. It was endurance, not of the body, but of the mind, the soul. One man clawed at the walls with such violence, he left bloody handprints in the timber, screaming to be let out. The barn doors wouldn't budge, not until morning. When they did, he was gone. His hat was found in the loft, his boots neatly left beside the ladder, but no sign of him. No one ever found a body. Not then, not later, just absence. And then there was the widow, waiting always. She never wept, never smiled. She'd stand on the porch at sunrise, her arms crossed tight to her chest, watching the barn. Sometimes a man would stumble out, fall to his knees, and crawl away. Sometimes there'd be nothing. Once a mother came to her door. Her son had been the seventh. A kind boy, too kind, who'd come to Stillwater looking for land and found only legend. The mother was gray-haired and shaking, holding a locket in her hands, like it could bargain with the dead. "Please," she said, "please stop this." The widow stared at her a long moment and said, not cruelly, but like someone stating a fact, "It's not me choosing." Then she closed the door and didn't open it again for 3 days. Inside the barn, things happened that time couldn't hold. One man said he saw his father, dead 20 years, standing in the corner with his eyes sewn shut. Another claimed he heard his own voice echoing back at him, whispering things he'd never said aloud. There were sounds that didn't belong in a barn. A baby's cry, chains dragging, a match being struck in the dark, lanterns that stayed lit without oil, doors that opened when no one was near them, a rope that swayed from the rafters, though there was no wind. Some tried to mark the walls with their names, carving into the wood with knives or nails. By morning, the names were gone. The wood had healed, as if it refused to remember those who failed. The barn kept no records. Only the widow remembered, and even she had stopped saying the names aloud. She'd bury their belongings in a box beneath the porch, knives, lockets, belt buckles, and say nothing when the townsfolk asked. They learned not to ask. The people of Stillwater grew used to the pattern. A man would arrive. He'd talk big. He'd head to the widow's porch, and she'd point to the barn. "If you last, you may stay." Then night would fall, and the town would go quiet, and the wind would carry strange smells: copper, sulfur, burning cedar. The saloon would close early. No one played the piano on those nights. Even the dogs didn't bark. With every failure, the town's fear grew thicker, like a fog that settled in the bones. But something else grew too: loneliness, and then one did. He rode in at dusk, when the shadows stretched long and the sky bled rust and lavender. No name, no welcome. Just the slow creak of saddle leather, the soft breath of a weary horse, and a man cloaked in dust, like he'd traveled from somewhere no one dared speak of. The townsfolk of Stillwater noticed him the way prairie dogs notice the hawk, warily, cautiously, sensing a storm beneath the surface. His face was all edges and scars, not the kind earned in bar fights, but the quiet kind, deep, white, healed wrong. One crossed the side of his neck like a blade had once kissed too close. His eyes were gray, flat, and distant, like the wind had long ago blown out whatever light they once held. He didn't speak much, just nodded at the blacksmith, tipped his hat at the saloon keeper, and took a glass of water instead of whiskey. He sat outside the general store for an hour, watching people, listening more than looking. When someone asked where he came from, he only said, "South." When they pressed, he looked past them, as if the answer lived in some ruin behind his thoughts. A boy tried to help him tie up his horse and asked his name. The cowboy stared at him and said nothing. The boy never asked again. There was something about him that rubbed against the town's rhythm. Stillwater was used to talkers, men who bragged before bleeding, who thought the widow was a challenge to win. But this one was different. He carried his silence like a blade, and people felt it. Even the dogs didn't bark when he passed. Rumors spread fast. Someone said they saw the hilt of a Confederate knife under his coat. Others claimed he used to be a sheriff, until he wasn't. One old-timer swore he recognized him from a wanted poster outside El Paso, where 6 men were found dead in a burned-down jailhouse. But nobody could say for sure. The man didn't offer a past. He just existed, like a scar across the land. After his second day in Stillwater, he rode to the edge of town and stood looking at the barn. It sat on the widow's property like a wound that wouldn't close, dark and too still. The doors slightly ajar, though no wind touched them. From town, you could almost hear the creaking wood at night. Some said the barn whispered. Some said it sang. Old Tom Reynolds was the first to warn him. He shuffled up beside the cowboy on the porch of the saloon, spit into the dust, and said, "Son, I've seen men twice your size cry for their mothers come sunrise. Don't go near her. She ain't right." The cowboy didn't answer. He just kept looking at the barn like it owed him something. Later, Miss Lila from the church found him sitting outside the general store, staring at a broken horseshoe. She placed her hand on his shoulder and said gently, "That place don't fix people. It finishes them." He looked up at her then, really looked, and said, voice low and raw, "That's fine. I ain't come here to be fixed." By the end of the 3rd day, he rode straight to her land. No fanfare, no noise, just hooves on dry earth and the weight of fate pressing down with every step. The horses near the barn didn't stir as he approached. Not one whinnied or flinched. They just watched, eyes dark and still, as if they recognized him, as if they'd been waiting. The widow stood on her porch like she always did, one hand resting on the wooden post, the other brushing a curl of white hair from her face. She wore black as usual, but the light behind her made her silhouette glow gold at the edges. When she saw him, she didn't flinch, didn't narrow her eyes like she often did with newcomers. She looked at him a long moment, her expression unreadable, something like memory flashing across her face. And then she spoke. "If you ain't scared of ghosts." The sentence hung in the air like a spell half cast. He swung off his horse, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. Dust rose. He walked up the porch steps, slow and measured, like a man walking toward the gallows without fear. He didn't smile, didn't offer his name, just looked at her with those haunted eyes and replied, "I sleep just fine with the dead." She studied him, then nodded once, curt and final. No words after that. Just a glance toward the barn, then silence. The barn door was open. It always was. But now, under the weight of his presence, it seemed wider, hungrier. From town, people watched from windows and doorways. No one spoke, no one stopped him. There was a stillness in the air, like the land itself held its breath. Mothers clutched children, bartenders paused mid-pour. Even the horses in the corral stilled, ears pricked. As he walked toward the barn, the wind shifted. It It was subtle at first, a coolness across the neck, a faint smell of old wood and burnt sugar. Then the lanterns near the widow's porch flickered, though the air was still. A low groan echoed from the barn beams, like the wood was stretching or remembering. He didn't pause, didn't look back. When he stepped across the barn's threshold, the wind slammed the doors shut behind him. The widow stood unmoving on her porch, eyes fixed on the barn. For the first time in years, she whispered something no one could hear. Her hand trembled slightly against the railing. Whether it was fear or hope, no one could say. And Stillwater held its breath again. This time, it felt different. The barn swallowed him whole, not just in size, but in silence. The air inside was colder than it should have been, like stepping down into an old well or a crypt that forgot the sun. He paused just inside the threshold, waiting for his eyes to adjust, listening to the sudden vacuum of sound. Outside, the wind stirred the prairie grass and whispered around corners. In here, it was as if time had been folded and pinned to the dark. He moved slowly, deliberate in each step, like someone who'd been here before in another life. The barn stretched wide and tall, rafters arched like a cathedral of timber and shadow. Dust floated in shafts of fading daylight that squeezed through cracks in the wood. Empty stalls lined the walls, their gates half open, as if something had stepped out just before he arrived. He dropped his bedroll dead center on the packed dirt floor. No blankets, no fire. Just the essentials and a man with nowhere else to run. The stallion, the one the town talked about, jet black, too still, eyes too knowing, stood in a back corner, unmoving. It didn't stamp or snort. It just stared at him, nostrils flaring slow, like it recognized something behind his eyes. The cowboy nodded once to it, respectful, as if greeting an old soldier. He unrolled the bedding with the silence of ritual, then sat down cross-legged, boots off, coat still on. He took out a pocket knife and a piece of old leather, working the blade across it slowly, not to sharpen, but to keep his hands from trembling. The barn creaked above him, wood moaning with age and pressure. But no wind blew. That was the first thing he noticed. No breeze, not even through the broken window near the rafters. The air was still, too still. That's when he heard it. A hoof step. But not from the stallion. It came from the other end of the barn, near the tack room. Slow, singular, sharp against the wood like a nail tapping on bone. Then another, then silence. He stood, eyes sweeping the room. "I don't scare easy," he muttered to the air. "But you already know that, don't you?" No reply. Only more silence. And then, a whisper. Not a word, a breath. Too close to his ear. He spun, knife raised, but nothing was there. Just the hayloft above and a scatter of straw settling as if someone had moved through it. He looked up, half expecting to see eyes staring down. Instead, he saw a rope swaying gently from the rafters, though no hand or wind moved them. The barn had memory. That was clear now. He sat back down. And that's when the voices came. They weren't loud. They weren't clear. They came like thoughts that weren't his. Half-formed, aching, desperate. A woman crying softly. A man begging. A horse screaming. Gunshots. Fire. His own name spoken not by voice, but by guilt. Then came the flashbacks. He saw the trenches again. Muddy, filled with firelight and the screams of dying boys. The war had carved a trench through his soul, not just the land. He saw the face of Elijah, his oldest friend, mouth open in shock, chest torn open by shrapnel. "You said you'd cover me," Elijah had whispered. and then he was gone. That same line repeated now, spoken by the barn itself in Elijah's voice. "You said you'd cover me?" He slammed his fist into the ground. "Not here," he growled. "Not again." But the barn didn't care. The walls seemed to bend, tilt inward. The hay shifted. The rafters groaned as if something climbed across them. A shadow flitted just above his head, quick, hunched, unnatural. The stallion let out a low huff, but didn't bolt. It only backed deeper into the shadows, ears twitching towards something unseen. Then the door behind him opened an inch, just a creak. But when he turned, no wind touched his face. No tracks lay in the dirt. "Break him," a voice whispered from above. It wasn't a ghost, he realized. Not in the way people meant. It wasn't one thing. It was all of it. The barn was the ghost. The weight of every man who'd failed. Their fear, their final breath, the shame they carried. It lived here, soaked into the beams and floorboards, like blood into cotton. The barn didn't haunt you with what it was. It haunted you with what you were. Still, he didn't leave. He unwrapped a small flask from his pack, took one slow sip, and placed it beside the bedroll. Then he lay down flat, one arm under his head, the other resting on his chest. His eyes stayed open. A sound scraped above. Footsteps again. Too light to be boots, too human to be rats. And then laughter. A child's laughter, sharp and sudden, like a match strike in the dark. He sat up, heart hammering now, sweat on his brow despite the cold. "I don't know what you are," he said aloud, "but I've lived through worse." The barn disagreed. The hay near his bedroll shifted as if something unseen had taken a seat right beside him. He froze. Breath on his neck, ice in his spine. Then, nothing. Whatever it was watching. Not to kill, not yet. Just to see what he would do when the long night stretched into madness. But he didn't run. He didn't cry out. He just sat there, waiting to be broken, or not. Outside, the moon rose high, casting a pale blue through the barn's skeleton. Inside, the cowboy kept still. And the barn watched. Morning came slow and reluctant, as if even the sun wasn't sure it wanted to see what had survived the night. But it came all the same. First a gray light pressing through the broken slats of the barn, then gold, spilling over the fields and into the town beyond. Birds began to stir. The wind, absent for hours, returned with a sigh through the grass. And there he was, alive. He stood by the stump out front, splitting wood with measured strikes. No hurry, no wasted motion. Shirt sleeves rolled up, breath steaming in the morning chill. Each chop echoed through the valley like a heartbeat refusing to stop. He didn't look shaken, not even tired, just quiet, focused, as if last night had been a test he already knew he'd pass. From the porch, the widow watched. She leaned against the rail, arms folded, hair down from its usual tight knot. She wore no shawl despite the cold, though her eyes narrowed against the brightness of morning. She watched him the way a farmer watches a strange star in the sky, uncertain if it means luck or ruin. He hadn't screamed, hadn't run, hadn't begged. And now here he was, splitting wood like he belonged. She said nothing at first, just watched. Until he glanced up, barely nodding, and continued working. The axe rose and fell. Wood split clean. No hesitation. She turned and disappeared inside. Moments later, the screen door creaked open behind him. He didn't look up until she spoke. You take sugar?" He stopped mid-swing, wiped the sweat from his brow, and finally faced her. "Just black," he said. Her eyes narrowed a little more, but she disappeared again. A few minutes later, she returned and stood on the edge of the porch, holding out a steaming mug. He approached, slow, respectful, like a man on another man's land. She handed him the cup without a word, her fingers brushing his just slightly. He took it and nodded again, not thanks, not gratitude, but acknowledgement. Then he took a sip and looked out across the horizon. She studied him. "You heard them, didn't you?" He didn't pretend not to understand. "I've heard worse." That answer seemed to settle something in her shoulders. She looked down at her hands, then out toward the barn. "You're the first man who came back in the morning, looking like himself." "Maybe I ain't," he said. She almost smiled at that. Almost. He sipped again, and for a while, neither of them spoke. Just stood there. Two figures carved out of old wood and firelight, letting the day stretch between them like a stitched-up wound. "Coffee's good," he said finally. "It's the water," she replied. "This land, it holds things." She didn't explain what she meant, and he didn't ask. But he understood. Some places remember. And this place remembered everything. That night, the barn didn't ask him to stay. He chose it. After supper, cornbread, beans, and silence, he gathered his gear, nodded toward the porch, and headed back across the yard. The wind had picked up again, tugging at the trees, rattling the old weather vane on the roof. The barn stood as it always had, crooked, waiting, full of stories with no endings. He opened the door without pause. Inside, it felt the same. Cold, dense, like breath held too long. The stallion snorted once and turned its head toward him, as if surprised he'd returned. He nodded to the animal, laid his bedroll in the same spot, and took a seat. No knife this time, no flask, just him and whatever waited. But the whispers didn't come right away. Instead, he felt a presence, not threatening, not curious, just watching. He looked up toward the rafters, toward the hayloft, then around at the stalls. "Go on then," he said quietly. "Let's hear it." A gust of wind blew through, though the doors were closed. Dust kicked up around his boots. A shadow passed over the far wall, stretching tall, too tall to be his. Then came the voices again, but softer. Not screams, not threats, just murmurs, regret, longing, fragments of lives poured out and trapped. He closed his eyes, and he listened. He heard a woman humming, voice breaking like a cracked bell. A child calling for someone who never answered. The sound of a rope creaking from above, once, twice. Then silence. He didn't flinch, didn't run. Because beneath all that noise, beneath the fear and tragedy, he could sense something else. Burial. Not just of bodies, but of truths, of choices, of guilt. He understood then. This barn wasn't cursed because of something evil. It was cursed because it was never allowed to forget. And the widow? She wasn't the one who chose who stayed and who broke. The barn did. He lay back slowly, arms crossed behind his head, staring up into the dark. "I ain't here to prove nothing," he whispered. "But I ain't afraid to listen." Somewhere above him, a board creaked. The stallion huffed again. And then, nothing. The barn, for once, was quiet. And the man, scarred and silent, closed his eyes and drifted to sleep, not with peace, but with something close to understanding. It wasn't the third night that broke the silence between them, nor the fourth. It was the 5th. He had kept returning to the barn each evening, laying out his bedroll with the same steady hands, settling in as though the darkness and the whispers had grown familiar. The widow would watch from her porch, coffee in hand, gaze unreadable. But on the 5th morning, after he came walking out like he always did, she didn't wait for him to come to her. She met him halfway. He was just setting his axe down by the stump, wiping the sweat from his brow, when her voice stopped him cold. "Come inside," she said. Not an offer, a summons. He followed without question. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and faded lilac, with sunlight filtering through yellowed curtains. She poured 2 cups, sat at the table, and nodded for him to do the same. He lowered himself into the creaking chair across from her. Neither spoke for a while. The coffee steamed between them like breath in winter. Then she said it. "It ain't my husband's ghost in that barn." He didn't move, didn't blink, just waited. She went on. "It's the man he killed." Her voice cracked, not with tears, but with the strain of holding in something heavy for far too long. He was a drifter. Came here looking for work, or maybe just a warm place to sleep. My husband. He was already drinking too much by then, always spoiling for a fight. Thought the stranger was looking at me too long, called him out to the barn. I begged him not to, but... She looked down at her hands, fingers trembling against the mug. I heard the shot. Just one. Never saw the man again. Never asked where he was buried. He exhaled slowly, like he'd been holding his breath for years. "Under the floorboards?" he asked. She nodded. "3rd stall from the left, right beneath where you lay your head." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was sacred. He didn't curse, didn't recoil. He just reached for his cup and took another sip, eyes steady. "All this time," she said, "they thought I was cursed. That every man who came was punished by my husband's spirit. But it wasn't him. He died drunk in a ditch a year later. Never even looked back at this place." He set the cup down gently. "It was the man he wronged." "Yes." She looked at him with something between sorrow and respect. They all thought they could conquer that barn. Swaggered in like heroes, left screaming, or not at all. But you stayed. "I stayed," he said simply. "Why?" He looked down for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. "Because guilt don't scare me when it already lives in me." Her eyes softened. He continued. "I seen worse things than shadows. Done worse things than watching a man die. There was a boy once, in my company, wide-eyed. Couldn't have been more than 16. Took a bullet meant for me. I see his face every night. Don't need a haunted barn for that." Her fingers curled tighter around the cup. "So you understand." He nodded. "I do." The light shifted through the window, slanting across the table. Dust motes danced in the beams like spirits given form. She stared into them. "All these years," she whispered. "I've waited for someone to say that." They sat in silence again, but this time it felt like 2 pieces clicking into place. The weight of confession hung in the room, but it had been shared now. No longer just hers to carry. "You want me to dig him up?" he asked. She looked at him sharply, then shook her head. "No, let him rest. He just wanted someone to know, to understand. I think maybe that's all he ever wanted." He stood slowly, the chair scraping back across the wooden floor. "You'll be back in the barn tonight?" she asked, already knowing the answer. He gave a slight nod. As he stepped onto the porch, the wind picked up again, stirring the trees and the dust in the yard. He paused at the top step, hand resting on the post. "I think he knows," he said over his shoulder. She looked up. "He knows I'm not trying to escape." She gave him a long look. "You're not." He descended the steps and walked back toward the barn, boots crunching across dry earth. The door opened with a groan, just like always. But inside, the air felt different. Less hostile, more like waiting. He laid out his bedroll over the third stall from the left, sat down, and listened. The wind outside slowed. The boards above creaked once, but not with menace. Just the sigh of an old place easing into memory. No hoofbeats this time. No whispers, only stillness. A kind of peace. He lay back and stared at the ceiling, tracing the knots in the wood, the patterns of time carved into every inch. He whispered, "I ain't here to judge you, friend, just keeping you company." And for the first time since he arrived, the barn gave no reply. Only the sound of a man breathing easy, surrounded by the quiet truth buried beneath the floorboards. The ghost did not vanish. It faded. Its presence, once heavy like the tension before a gunshot, began to lift like fog after dawn. The barn still held its history, and the nights still whispered of things long buried. But the air no longer bristled with menace. What had once been a place of warning had become, slowly and almost imperceptibly, a place of rest. The cowboy knew it the morning he stepped out and realized the wind wasn't biting anymore. It sighed, like something exhaling after holding its breath for years. Even the horses felt it. The widow's 2 remaining mares, once skittish near the barn doors, began grazing closer, sometimes even wandering inside without hesitation. Their ears didn't twitch toward invisible sounds. Their hooves no longer danced in nervous circles. The barn, it seemed, had remembered how to be just a barn. He worked the land without needing to ask. No agreement was made, no conversation held. He just picked up a hammer, found loose nails, and fixed them. The widow watched him from the porch as he moved along the fence line, with quiet purpose, as though he'd lived there all his life, and knew every knot and every post. She didn't stop him. In fact, she found herself bringing him water around midday, standing with him for a moment beneath the wide, endless sky, watching the dust rise from where he tamped down the soil. Together, they brought the ranch back to life. One board, one nail, one shovel of turned earth at a time. She found herself speaking again, not of ghosts or guilt, but of cattle feed, weather forecasts, and irrigation ditches. He listened the way only a man with a battered soul could listen. Patiently, without needing to fill the silences, the townsfolk noticed. Whispers, once cruel and carried like knives in the wind, started to dull. A few even ventured close enough to leave goods at the gate. Fresh bread, a sack of oats, a pair of gloves. No one knocked, no one lingered. But the message was clear. They saw the change. The curse, they believed, was lifted. The widow, once pitied and feared, was no longer whispered about in the saloon corners. She had weathered the storm, and someone had stood beside her when no one else would. Children dared each other to peek over the fence. The bravest managed to glimpse the cowboy fixing shingles on the barn roof or leading a mare to water. The more they saw, the more the stories changed. He wasn't a gunslinger or a bounty hunter, not a ghost chaser or a witch's pawn, just a man with calloused hands and a silent mouth who did more work by noon than most did all week. And the widow, she began to smile. Not the ghost smile folks remembered, the kind that looked like it hurt to wear. This smile was quieter, subtler. It didn't demand attention, but it warmed the room when it came. She wore her hair looser now, let it fall over her shoulders when the wind picked up. Sometimes she sang while sweeping the porch, a tune so faint and fragile it felt like memory itself. The creak of the barn's old hinges, once sharp and shrill like a warning, now swung smooth with oil. He had repaired them in the evening, working by lantern light. She had watched from the doorway, neither speaking nor offering help, just bearing witness to the quiet act of restoration. In that moment, it became clear. It wasn't just the barn he was fixing. It was everything. One afternoon, while mending the fence near the north pasture, he found the old brass bit from a bridle buried in the dirt. He held it up, brushed the soil off with his thumb, and brought it to her. She turned it over in her hands, eyes distant. "That belonged to my husband," she said quietly, "before he became mean." He didn't pry, just nodded and set it on the windowsill of the barn, letting it catch the late sun like a memory polished clean. At dusk, they often stood in the yard without speaking, watching the sky turn from a fire to ash. Some nights, he lit the fire near the barn, and she brought out 2 tin mugs of coffee or sometimes a flask of something stronger. They didn't talk about the past, nor the ghost, nor the blood in the soil. Those things no longer needed to be spoken aloud. They just were. Part of the land, part of them. The townsfolk, despite their growing curiosity, still kept a respectful distance. No one tried to come past the gate. No one dared ask questions. Whatever had happened on that ranch, the killings, the hauntings, the healing, it belonged to the widow and the cowboy now. It was their story, and no one else's to retell. He built her a new gate before the first frost came, sanded it smooth, carved a wildflower into the post. Not to make a statement, but just because it felt right. She touched it with her fingertips when she passed, then glanced at him, her gaze warm and unreadable. Winter was coming, but it didn't frighten them. The barn was sealed tight. The roof held strong. The fields were turning golden, the last breath of autumn folding gently into the soil. And in the heart of the ranch, something long buried had stirred, not just the bones beneath the floorboards, but something deeper. Trust, belonging, a life beginning again, even after everything had burned. The land had remembered them, and in turn, they remembered themselves. The wind picked up just after sundown, not the whispering kind that rattled loose boards or stirred memory through the rafters, but a full-bodied storm rolling in from the north, dragging with it the scent of wet earth and far-off thunder. The sky bruised slowly, deep blue swelling into slate, into black. Lightning flickered across the horizon like the last warnings of something ancient rising from the soil. The cowboy stood at the barn door and watched it come, the brim of his hat low, his coat unbuttoned like he welcomed the wind. When the rain hit, it came sideways. Sheets of it pounded the roof, drummed against the windows of the house, hissed through the grasses like 1,000 voices crying out. But the barn held. The boards didn't groan, the roof didn't leak. Nothing buckled, nothing gave way. The place that had once cracked under the weight of a haunted past now stood strong beneath the fury of the present. Inside, the horses were calm, even as thunder cracked so close it shook the foundation. He remained there as it raged, arms folded, watching the storm batter the world around them. It felt like a test, not from the ghost, not from the land, but from something deeper, as if the earth itself wanted to see if he would run this time. But he didn't. He stayed rooted like a fence post driven deep, unmovable and unafraid. When morning broke, the sky had softened to ash. The clouds hung low but quiet, and the air smelled like rebirth. Wet earth, cleansed wood, possibility. The widow walked out to meet him at the barn, her boots squelching in the mud. She carried nothing but a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges, creased from being opened and closed too many times to count. He knew what it was before she handed it over. The deed, to the land, to the barn, to everything that had tried and failed to destroy her. She didn't say, "It's yours," or "You earned it." No declarations, no formalities. Just her eyes, steady and calm, her fingers brushing his as she passed it to him. It wasn't a gift. It wasn't a favor. It was understanding. A silent agreement between two souls who had buried too much to ever speak it all aloud. She turned and walked back to the house without another word. He stood for a long time with the deed in his hand before slipping it into his coat pocket like a letter from someone who'd forgiven him. Later that day, just as dusk began to settle over the hills, he walked the land alone. No tools in hand, no horse, no destination,